So as I said at the end of the first video, these two angles, angle 1 and angle 2, are going to be supplementary towards each other, okay, to each other. So meaning these two angles would add up to 180 degrees. Okay? Well, we're not so certain about angle 1 and angle 6 at this moment. So that's one we're going to kind of put off to the side at this moment. Let's go ahead and take a look at angle 1 and angle 5. Okay? So angle 1 and angle 5, while it may not quite look like it, okay, are actually going to be congruent to each other. And since they're on the same side of the transversal, they would be corresponding angles. Okay, that congruency and being on the same side of the transversal would make them corresponding angles. Well, you could look at this and being like, well, how could you prove necessarily that these corresponding angles are congruent? Okay, because you can't just assume that angles are congruent because they look close to it or they look like it. That's not good mathematical practice. Okay, so the way to prove this is you can take any of the parallel lines and translate them on top of each other. Okay, so here, and you may want to consider writing this down, but really you're just translating line R to the position that line S is. Okay, and that's what, so if you're just taking line R, sliding it over, and putting it on top of line S, you would get this diagram over here. You can see line R and line S are the same line now, as you translated it over, and the transversal T is still the same slope angle. When you do that, you're technically stacking these angles on top of each other, meaning angle 5 would be stacked on top or correspond, this is where the corresponding word comes from, with angle 1. And you can see that right here. Angle 1 and angle 5 are now the same angle. Okay, so we can say that angle 1 is congruent to angle 5, and this is the symbol right here for congruency. It's an equal sign with a little squiggly line above it. Okay, and then you would see that angle 6 and angle 2 are also congruent. Angle 7 and angle 3 are congruent, and angle 8 and angle 4 are also congruent based off of excuse me, translating and then having the parallel lines on top of each other, just like this. Okay, so that's how you can figure out your corresponding angles. So angle 1 and angle 5 correspond to each other. There are other corresponding angles that are in here as well, such as angle 6 and angle 2. Okay, so we can see angle 2 is congruent with angle 6. Angle 4 would be congruent with angle 8, these two. And angle 7 and angle 3 would also be congruent. Okay, so once again, notice that corresponding angles are always congruent to each other and are on the same side of the transversal. Okay, so 7 and 3, 4 and 8, 2 and 6, 1 and 5, same side of that transversal. Okay, yeah, that's all I got for you there, guys. Let's keep moving on. So the next set of angles that we're going to look at are what's called alternate interior angles and same side interior angles. Okay, which sounds like a mouthful, but if you break it down, you can get a better understanding of what these type of angles are. So that's what I kind of like doing. That's what we're going to do with these. So first of all, you're looking at angles. So we get that idea out of the way. We're looking for angles. Next aspect here is we want to find interior angles. Well, think about what the word interior means. When you think of the word interior, whether it's interior design and the interior of a house or the interior of a school or whatever it may be. When you're referring to the interior, you're talking about the inside. Okay, interior is another way to say inside. So you're looking for inside angles. Well, here's line R and here's line S. Okay, what angles in here would be interior? Okay, well, interior angles are the angles that are inside of the two parallel lines. Okay, they're your parallel lines. Interior angles would be the angles on the inside. So angle 6, angle 1, angle 4, and angle 7. Okay, all of those are interior. They are in between the two parallel lines and then cut by the transversal. Now we're looking at the word alternate. Okay, a lot of definitions that you can consider for alternate, but it's just in this case, when we're talking about alternate, talking about kind of like going back and forth, they're all alternating a little bit, but they're alternate angles. Okay, so for this, when we're looking at alternate, we're not looking at the same side, so 1 and 6 wouldn't work, and we're not looking for what would be called adjacent angles, so like 1 and 4 wouldn't work either. So that just leaves 1 and 7. So 1 and 7 would be what we would call alternate interior angles. They're alternate because they're on the they're kind of like on the opposite side of the transversal, and they're not adjacent to each other. Okay, so they're kind of opposite. They're alternate of each other. Okay, these two angles, believe it or not, are congruent. So alternate interior angles will always, and this is something you should write down, will always be congruent. So angle 1 will be congruent to angle 7. And that's what's represented over here. You can say equivalent or you can say congruent. Use that geometry terminology. Then we can say the same thing with measurement of angle 4 and measurement of angle 6. They will also be congruent to each other. Okay, because of alternate interior angles. Okay, this is another one you might like kind of question a little bit on, like, well, how would you know? You know, you can't use the whole translated over aspect that we did before, and you're right with that. Okay, here is a little trick that you can use just to kind of remember with alternate interior angles. Okay, we already know that corresponding angles are congruent. So like angle 1 and angle 5, which are corresponding, are congruent. Well, another principle which we had talked about earlier in the year, and you may have learned at a previous time, but this should be a refresher to you. Okay, what we would call as vertical angles, opposite angles, are always congruent. So technically, angle 5 and angle 7 are going to be congruent to each other. And it's the same thing as angle 1 and angle 3, angle 2 and angle 4, angle 6 and angle 8 will always be congruent to each other. So since these corresponding angles are congruent to each other, and 5 and 7 are congruent to each other, that would also make 7 and 1 congruent to each other. So if 5 and 7 are congruent, then 1 and 5 are congruent. That means 1 and 7 must also be congruent to each other. Let's look at same side interior angles. Same side interior angles, well, we're looking at angles again. We're looking at interior angles, so still angles in between the two parallel lines. And we're looking at same side. Well, that should be pretty explanatory that we are looking at the same side angles. So same side of the transversal. So now we're going to look at angles 1. Let me get my eraser, a little tiny eraser. Okay. So we're going to look at the same side interior angles. So same side, so 1 and 6 and 7 and 4 are the angles we're going to look at. Okay, these angles are what we call supplementary. meaning these angles total, so the total measurement of the angles would be 180 degrees. And this is important to keep in mind as you'll work with some equations later with this content. So adding angle 1 and angle 6 would equal 180 degrees. Adding angle 4 and angle 7 also equal 180 degrees, and you can see that represented in these equations below. Okay, so if you have same side interior angles, they're not congruent to each other. They're just supplementary. All right, let's look at some examples. Or sorry, one last thing here. So knowing all this, putting this all together, really, there's two angles in this entire two parallel lines and transversals, because angle 1, angle 3, angle 5, and angle 7 are all congruent to each other, and angle 2, angle 4, angle 6, and angle 8 are all congruent to each other as well. You could use corresponding angles, alternate interior angles, same side angles, adjacent angles, supplementary angles. Okay, really figure this out. Vertical angles to do that. Okay, so let's look at some examples here. I want you guys to take a moment and determine, answer these two questions. So first, which angles are congruent to angle 8, which is down here? So list off all the angle numbers which are congruent to it. And then I want you to list off all the angles that are supplementary to angle 8. Okay, go ahead and do that now, guys. All right, so there are 3 angles that are congruent to angle 8. Okay, or I'm sorry. Yeah, there's 3 other angles that are congruent to it. So first one we can see is angle 6, which is directly across from it. Okay, forming that nice vertical angle across from it. Okay, we can find corresponding angles. So angle 8 and angle 4 are corresponding. So angle 4 is also congruent to it. And since angle 8 and angle 4 are congruent, okay, we know that angle 4 and angle 2 are going to be congruent to each other, and angle 6 and angle 2 are congruent to each other by corresponding, so that must make angle 8 and angle 2 also congruent to each other. What about supplementary? Well, there's a lot of supplementary angles here. Okay, first is angle 7. It's going to be supplementary. Angle 5, also supplementary. Well, if these are supplementary to them, their corresponding angles are also going to be supplementary. So that would make angle 1 supplementary and angle 3 also supplementary to angle 8. Okay, let's move on. All right, guys, so in the figure, you have A and B are parallel. I need you to identify what the measures of angle 4 and angle 5 are going to be. Go ahead and try that now. So angle 4 will be 99 degrees. That's my best attempt at that, because they're corresponding angles. So 99 degrees and angle 4 are corresponding, so 99 degrees. And angle 5 will be 81 degrees because angle 4 and angle 5 are supplementary to each other. So then they have to add up to 180 degrees. Okay, let's look at some more. So what are the measures of angle 7 and angle 2? Go ahead and do that now. Angle 7 is going to be 81 degrees. We know that because angle 4 was 99. These two are supplementary to each other, so it must be 81. Angle 2 will be 99 because they are vertical angles, and they will also be congruent to each other. Let's keep on moving on, guys. All right, in the figure, lines A, B, and C are parallel. What is the value for x? Okay, notice you have x plus 25 as degrees here. So go ahead, see if you can figure out what the value of x is going to be. So for this one, you would have to identify that the 75 degrees and x plus 25 degrees are supplementary angles. The way you can do that is 75 is corresponding angle with 6, which is corresponding to angle 10. And those would be supplementary. So you can set up your equation as 75 plus x plus 25 equals 180, and then solve that to get x equals 80. Take a look at this final one. Since these are corresponding angles, you would set them equal to each other, which would